I want you to picture the scene. It is May 28th, 1898.
Right.
We are in Turin, Italy. And the city is just absolutely buzzing because there's this massive royal exhibition going on. It's a huge celebration of Italian art, sacred history, all of that. But I actually don't want to talk about the crowds or the flags or the incense. I want to take you into a very small, very dark, chemical-smelling room.
Oh, a dark room.
Exactly, a makeshift dark room. And inside, there is this man named Secondo Pia. He is an amateur photographer, a lawyer by trade, actually, but he has been given a job that, well, nobody in history has ever had before. The king has allowed him to take the very first official photograph of the Shroud of Turin.
Which, up until this exact moment, you have to remember, was just seen as a very old, very faint, kind of yellowed linen cloth that had a sort of brownish smudge on it that people said was Jesus.
Right. To the naked eye, it is really unimpressive. It's blurry. You have to squint to see anything at all. So Pia is in this dark room. He has got this massive glass plate.
Because they didn't have film rolls back then.
Right. They use these heavy glass plates coated in emulsion. So he puts it into the developing tray. He is rocking the tray, he's smelling the fixative, watching under that dim red safety light.
And this is the moment where the history of this object basically splits in two.
He looks down at the plate. Now, normally, when you look at a photographic negative, everything is reversed. White faces look like dark, creepy masks. Shadows look like bright lights. It's usually confusing. But as the image clears on the glass, Secondo Pia almost drops the plate. He literally almost smashes history on the floor.
Because he wasn't looking at a negative.
He was looking at a positive. The image on the glass plate, the negative of the cloth, was a perfectly shaded, anatomically detailed, sharp portrait of a man. The eyes were deep set and tragic. The nose was broken. The beard, the hair, it suddenly had dimension. The cloth itself was acting like a photographic negative.
And this is the hook. This is the big aha moment that has driven researchers completely crazy for over 100 years, because you have to ask yourself the basic logic question here. If this is a medieval painting made in, say, 1350, how did the artist do it? Photography didn't exist.
Yeah.
The whole concept of negative light values didn't exist.
Right. Why would a medieval forger paint a confusing, blurry mess that only reveals its true masterpiece quality if you invert the light values 500 years in the future?
It creates a paradox. It is an image that was effectively locked until technology caught up to unlock it.
And that, my friend, is exactly what we are doing today. We are unlocking the file on the Shroud of Turin. But, and I need to be really, really clear about this up front, we are not here to preach. We aren't here to do the theological study.
No, we are here to look at the hard data. And I have to warn you, the listener, the data is, well, it's a mess.
It is a mess.
But it is a glorious, fascinating mess. We have a stack of sources here today that includes peer-reviewed journals, NASA imaging studies, radiocarbon reports, retracted papers, and even some medieval detective work.
We've got physics battling chemistry. We have history battling biology. We have pollen from Jerusalem and DNA from China.
The mission for this deep dive is to treat the shroud not as a religious icon, but as a crime scene object, a scientific anomaly. Because the harder you look at this piece of linen, the more it refuses to be categorized. It really doesn't fit in the blind faith box, but it absolutely doesn't fit in the simple medieval hoax box either.
So let's unpack this. If we're going to treat this as a crime scene, we need to bring in the forensics team. And the biggest forensics team to ever touch this thing was STURP.
The Shroud of Turin Research Project, 1978.
Now, when people hear Shroud Research, they probably picture a bunch of guys in robes or maybe some Vatican archivists with little white cotton gloves.
Not even close. STURP was arguably the most high-tech, aggressive scientific examination of an artifact ever conducted. This was a team of American scientists, mostly from the defense and aerospace industries. We are talking about guys from Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, CNIA, the Air Force Academy.
These are the guys who build nukes and put landers on Mars.
Exactly. And it is crucial to understand their mindset going in. They weren't believers. In fact, many of them were hardcore skeptics. Barry Schwartz, the documenting photographer for the team, is a great example of this.
Oh, I read about him.
Yeah, he's Jewish, so he had no religious attachment to Jesus whatsoever. He explicitly said he joined the team because he thought it would be an easy job. He thought, I'll go to Italy, I'll find the paint, I'll prove it's a fake, and I'll have a nice Italian vacation.
That was the whole vibe. Let's go debunk the medieval TARP.
Yeah.
And they brought, what, 6 tons of equipment?
6 tons. They created up X-ray fluorescence machines, infrared spectrometers, sticky tape applicators, cameras, microscopes. They literally turned the royal palace in Turin into a 24-hour laboratory. They had exactly 120 hours to examine the cloth, and they basically didn't sleep.
So let's get to the very first big question they had. Is it a painting? Because that is the easiest, most logical explanation. A monk in the 1300s gets some ochre paint, maybe some tempera, paints a tortured guy on a sheet, and sells tickets to pilgrims.
That was the baseline expectation. Walter Macrone, a famous microscopist, was convinced it was just iron oxide paint. So the Stirp team gets the cloth under the microscope. They're looking for brush strokes. They're looking for the meniscus. When liquid paint dries, it pools at the edges.
Like a coffee stain on a napkin, it leaves that dark ring.
Exactly. Or they're looking for capillary action. That's where the liquid paint soaks into the thread and spreads out along the fibers. And what they found was absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
No paint, no dye, no pigment, no stains. The image isn't made of anything added to the cloth.
Okay, hold on. If I look at a picture of a face, that picture has to be made of something. It has to be a physical substance. If it is not paint, what is it?
That is where it gets weird. The image is actually a degradation of the cellulose itself. It is a rapid dehydration and oxidation of the very top fibrils of the linen yarn. Think of it like a rapid aging or a scorching, but extremely controlled. And when I say top fibrils, I mean microscopic. The image only goes about 200 nanometers deep.
200 nanometers. I can't even visualize that.
It is thinner than a standard wavelength of light. It's thinner than the wall of a single soap bubble. If you took a razor blade and gently scraped the surface of the shroud, you would shave the entire image right off. Beneath that 200 nanometer layer, the threads are perfectly white, pristine linen.
So whatever made this image, it didn't soak in at all. It just touched the surface.
Touched is a gentle word. It altered the surface chemistry without penetrating. A liquid, by definition, penetrates. So they ruled out painting entirely. They ruled out dyes.
And they ruled out scorching, right? Like from a hot metal statue. Because I know that was a popular theory for a while.
Right, that was a big theory. Someone heated a bronze life-size statue and pressed the cloth onto it. But scorch marks fluoresce. They glow under UV light. The Stirp team hit the shroud with UV light, and the image does not fluoresce. Interestingly, the background cloth does, but the image itself does not. So it's not a thermal scorch.
This leads us to the piece of tech that I think is the absolute star of the Stirp show. The VP8 image analyzer. This sounds like something straight out of Star Trek.
It practically was for 1978. The VP8 wasn't made for art critics or historians. It was made for NASA. Its job was to take 2D photographs of planets like Mars or the Moon and convert the light and dark signals into topography, into physical maps of mountains and valleys.
So a bright spot means high elevation, and a dark spot means low elevation.
Sort of. It interprets gain or brightness as vertical elevation. Now, here's the fundamental problem with using it on a normal picture. If I take a standard black and white photo of you right now and put it in the VP8, it's going to look like a disaster.
Why? I have a perfectly lovely face.
You do. But in a photograph, your face is defined by shadows. If the lamp in the room is shining from the left, your right cheek is cast in shadow. It's dark. The VP8 will read that dark cheek as a canyon or a literal hole in your face. Your nose might look like a mountain because it's catching the light, but your eyes might look like incredibly deep caves. It is distorted because the light is directional.
Okay, I see. A normal photo depends entirely on where the lamp is standing in the room.
Yeah.
The light is fake depth.
Exactly. But they took the photograph of the shroud, this flat 2D image, and fed it into the VP8. And on the little green monitor, a perfect, undistorted 3D relief of a human body appeared.
No canyon cheeks.
No distortion at all. The nose rose up naturally, the cheeks sloped down smoothly, the chest was higher than the hands that were resting on it.
So what does that actually prove in a hard science sense?
It proves that the image on the shroud contains spatial information. It means the darkness of the image is not caused by a shadow from a lamp. It is caused by distance. The parts of the cloth that were physically touching the body, like the tip of the nose, are the darkest. The parts that were slightly hovering over the skin, like the eye sockets, are lighter. The further the cloth was from the body, the fainter the image.
Wow. It's like a literal distance map.
Precisely. It is a 3D dataset encoded into a 2D sepia image. And here's the kicker for the historians. You cannot do that with a paintbrush. You cannot do that with a photograph. No medieval artist, no matter how brilliant, could look at a blank canvas and say, I'm going to paint this nose at a 90% gray value because it represents exactly a 2 millimeter distance from the cloth. It is humanly impossible to calculate and execute that.
So the STIRP team packs up their 6 tons of gear. They fly back to America. They crunch this mountain of data for 3 years. And what is their final conclusion?
Their conclusion was basically a giant, highly educated shrug. They published a final summary report in 1981 stating that they could answer definitively what the shroud was not. It wasn't a painting, it wasn't a scorch, it wasn't a rubbing. But they explicitly stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, we can provide no mechanism for the formation of this image.
One of the scientists had that famous line. He said, "We can put a man on the moon, but we can't reproduce this cloth."
That was the exact sentiment. They proved it was a unique object. And for a while, the mystery was the only story. It looked like hard science was actually backing up the miracle.
Until 1988, the year everything changed.
The year the hammer fell.
We have to talk about the carbon-14 dating. This was billed as the final exam. The Vatican finally said yes. They allowed a small strip to be cut from the corner of the shroud.
This was a massive deal. 3 separate independent labs were chosen: Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona. These are the gold standard labs for radiocarbon dating. They used accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS, which doesn't just look at decay, it counts the actual carbon atoms. It is incredibly precise.
And the confidence was so high on both sides, everyone thought, okay, this will finally settle it. If it is 2,000 years old, it's from the time of Jesus. If it is 700 years old, it's a fake.
And the results came back, and they were devastatingly specific.
The envelope, please.
1260 to 1390 AD.
1260 to 1390. That is, well, it's the Middle Ages.
It is not just the Middle Ages. It hits the absolute bullseye of the skeptics' timeline. Because the first time the shroud appears in indisputable written historical records is around 1355 in a little church in Lorraine, France. So if the carbon dating says this cloth was flax growing in a field in 1300, and the historical record says a guy showed up with this cloth in 1350, then the math is incredibly simple. Medieval fabrication. That was the headline all over the world. Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, published the results. The British Museum held a press conference. They basically stood up and said, "Show's over, folks. It is a very clever medieval hoax."
And I remember hearing about this, or at least the cultural echo of it. The impact was huge. The shroud basically became a joke in academic circles. It was the fake Jesus cloth.
For mainstream science, the file was permanently closed. They didn't care about the 3D data or the lack of paint anymore. Carbon dating is the undisputed king of archaeology. If C14 says 1300, it's 1300. The STIRP guys were left looking like gullible idiots.
And this is why we do a deep dive. We don't just stop at the headline, because there was a really big problem with the case closed verdict.
A massive problem. The C14 dating explained the date perfectly, but it completely failed to explain the object. You still had a cloth sitting there with no paint, photographic negative properties, and 3D encoded distance maps. If a medieval artist made it in 1350, he was a time traveler who understood quantum physics and topography.
So you have a total collision of data. The physics says impossible. The chemistry says medieval. Usually in science, when that happens, you check your samples.
And that is exactly what Ray Rogers did.
Let's talk about Rogers. He was on the original STIRP team, right?
Yes. And I love Ray Rogers as a character in this story because he was just a grump. He was a very serious thermal chemist from Los Alamos. He did not care about theology at all. In fact, after the 1988 dating, he fully defended the radiocarbon results. He told people, look, we were wrong. It's medieval. Get over it.
So what on earth changed his mind?
A challenge. Someone in the research community claimed that the sample taken in 1988 came from a repaired section of the cloth. Rogers thought that was ridiculous. He basically set out to prove the repair theory wrong so he could just go back to his retirement in peace. He managed to get his hands on some leftover threads from that specific 1988 sample area.
And he looked at them under the microscope.
And he saw something that absolutely should not be there. He saw cotton.
Cotton.
The shroud is linen. It is pure flax. But in this specific corner, the exact corner they cut for the carbon dating, Rogers found cotton fibers twisted right in with the flax. And not just cotton. He found gum arabic and alizarin dye.
Wait, dye? I thought you said STIRP found absolutely no dye on this thing.
STIRP found no dye on the main image area. That is still true. But here, at the extreme edge, in the specific C14 sample zone, Rogers found dye.
So what does that actually mean for the timeline?
It led to what we call the invisible weave hypothesis. The theory goes exactly like this. The shroud is ancient. It has been handled for centuries. When bishops hold it up for crowds, they hold it by the corners. The corners get frayed, they get ripped, they get nasty. Sometime in the Middle Ages, maybe the 1500s, a team of expert weavers likely nuns, repaired the damage. They did something called French invisible reweaving.
Which is, I assume, really hard to do.
It is a lost art form. They take new thread, usually cotton because it takes dye much easier than linen, and they weave it strand by strand into the old frayed linen. They dye it to perfectly match the yellow, dirty old color. If they do it right, you cannot tell with the naked eye where the old cloth ends and the new patch begins.
So the argument here is that the scientists in 1988, the absolute best of the best, accidentally cut their sample right through a spliced patch.
Rogers called it a chimera, a mix of 1st century linen and 16th century cotton.
He had a really great analogy for this. He said dating the shroud from that corner was like dating a statue by the gum stuck to its base.
It is a perfect analogy. If your sample is 50% new material and 50% old material, your carbon date is going to be skewed by centuries. It's just averaging the two ages. Rogers actually calculated that if you had a mixture of roughly 60-40 old and new material, the date would average out exactly to the 1260 to 1390 range.
That is incredibly convenient. But is it true? I mean, did the broader scientific community look at this and say, oh, sorry, our bad?
No. Science is a battleship. It turns very slowly. Rogers published his findings in a peer-reviewed journal, Thermochimica Acta, in 2005, shortly before he died. It made huge waves. But later, around 2010, other microscopists looked at the threads and said, we don't see the splice. We think Rogers was interpreting the fiber structures wrong.
So it is not a slam dunk.
It's not a slam dunk, but it casts more than enough doubt on the 1988 dating to pry the door wide open again. It validated the idea that the sample might have been contaminated or unrepresentative of the main cloth.
Okay, so C14 is currently sitting in the maybe, maybe not pile. Do we have another clock? If we can't fully trust the carbon, is there another way to date a piece of fabric?
Enter the crystals.
This is the W-axis method, wide-angle X-ray scattering, which honestly sounds way cooler than carbon dating.
It is a totally different approach. Carbon dating measures the radioactive decay of an isotope. It's nuclear. WACS measures the structural aging of the crystal. See, linen is made of cellulose. Cellulose is basically a polymer crystal. Over time, over centuries and millennia, ambient humidity, heat, and natural background radiation cause the long chains of the crystal to break down. They depolymerize.
So the physical crystal structure falls apart at a predictable rate, sort of like rust on a car.
Exactly like that. It is an internal mechanical clock. It's like counting the rings on a tree, but at a molecular level. In 2022, a team led by Dr. Liberato De Caro in Italy used this exact method. They took a thread from the shroud, and importantly, they took it from the main body, not the questionable repaired corner.
And what time was on the crystal clock?
They compared the shroud's degradation profile to known linen samples from history. They tested verified medieval linen from the 1300s. It didn't match at all. The shroud was way more degraded. It was much older.
How much older are we talking?
They tested it against ancient linen from Fayum, Egypt, dating back to 3000 BC. That was too old. The crystal was too degraded. Then they tested it against linen from Masada.
Masada, the fortress in Israel, the one the Romans sieged in 74 AD.
That's the one. We know exactly how old the Masada linen is because the fortress famously fell in 74 AD. The degradation profile of the shroud was a near-perfect match for the Masada samples.
So WAXS says the cloth is roughly 2,000 years old.
It places it squarely in the window of 50 AD to 74 AD.
That is a massive contradiction to the carbon-14 date. We are talking a 1,300-year difference in the timeline.
It is. But I have to be the annoying expert here and add the critical caveat. The crystal clock isn't perfect either. It depends heavily on environmental assumptions, specifically temperature.
Temperature. How does that change the clock?
Heat speeds up the molecular breakdown of crystals. If you keep your linen in a hot oven, it will look ancient in just a few years. To get that 2,000-year date, the scientists have to assume the shroud was stored at an average temperature of about 20 to 22 degrees Celsius for most of its life.
So if it was stored in a hot baking attic somewhere in the Middle East for 500 years?
Then the crystal degrades faster, and the 2,000-year date is wrong. The cloth would actually be younger. But, historically speaking, sacred relics were usually kept in cool stone crypts or drafty cathedrals. So the room temperature assumption isn't crazy, but you have to acknowledge it is an assumption.
So we have physics pointing to the 1st century. Let's look at the biology. Because this piece of cloth has been traveling, it has been collecting a lot of frequent flyer miles.
This brings us to the dust and DNA chapter. In 2015, the University of Padua did a genomic sweep of the shroud. They basically vacuumed the cloth.
They vacuumed it, like
Mhm.
with a Hoover.
Very, very gently. They pulled microscopic dust and debris from deep between the fibers, and in that dust they found DNA, plant DNA and human DNA.
And what story does the DNA tell?
It tells a story of a world traveler. They found distinct plant DNA and human haplotypes from Western Europe, which is obvious, it's been in France and Italy for centuries. They found markers from the Middle East, specifically the Druze population, and plants native to Palestine.
Okay, that makes perfect sense if it started in Jerusalem.
But then they found the outliers. They found DNA markers from India, and they found DNA markers from China.
China? How does a burial cloth from Jesus or a medieval fake from France get Chinese DNA on it?
Well, there are two main interpretations of this data. Theory A is the Silk Road theory. This aligns with the legend of the Dandelion. There is a historical gap where the burial cloth of Jesus disappears from the record. The theory is that it was moved to Edessa, which is modern Turkey, and then to Constantinople. These were major bustling hubs on the Silk Road. Traders from China, India, and Persia were constantly passing through, venerating relics.
So just picked up genetic hitchhikers from the trade routes.
Exactly. A merchant from India touches the reliquary, some dust settles. It would imply the cloth has a deep history of travel that fits the ancient timeline perfectly.
And theory B.
Theory B is the tourist trap theory, or more scientifically, the contamination view. We have to remember the shroud hasn't been kept in a sterile vacuum bubble. It has been displayed constantly. People have literally kissed it.
Millions of people over the centuries.
And in the modern era, especially since the 1900s, tourists and pilgrims from all over the globe come to Turin. If a devout tourist from Beijing visited the cathedral in 1980 and sneezed, or even just shed some normal skin cells near the cloth, that DNA gets into the vacuum sample.
So the DNA map is either a sacred record of ancient travel, or it's just a guestbook of modern tourism.
It is highly likely a mix of both. But the presence of specific Middle Eastern pollens is much harder to explain away with just tourism.
The pollen? This is the forensic botany angle.
Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist, really started this line of inquiry. He used special sticky tape to pull pollen grains off the fibers. He claimed to identify Gundelia tournefortii.
Which is a flower.
It's a prickly thistle, a harsh thorn bush, and it is native to the semi-desert regions of the Middle East. Specifically, it grows right around Jerusalem. And this is the detail that always gives people chills. It blooms in the spring.
Passover is in the spring.
Exactly. If the shroud was exposed to the open air in Jerusalem during the time of the crucifixion, it would naturally catch the specific wind-blown pollen.
But, playing devil's advocate here, because we have to.
The skepticism is completely valid here. Identifying specific plant species from 2,000-year-old crushed, degraded pollen shells is incredibly difficult. Other expert botanists have looked at Frey's microscopic images and said, that could be a Jerusalem thistle, or it could just be a common weed from an Italian hillside. So again, it is incredibly compelling, but it is not definitive proof.
It really is a recurring theme of this entire deep dive. Compelling, but...
Yes, but. Always a but.
Let's transition to the blood. We know there is no paint on the image itself, but is there actual blood?
Yes. This is one thing the STURP team was absolutely definitive on. Adler and Heller, the blood chemists for the team, proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The stains contain hemoglobin, albumin, and they test positive for primates, specifically human, blood proteins. It is type AB blood.
Which, if I remember correctly, matches the Sudarium of Oviedo, right? That other famous face cloth in Spain.
It does match. Both are type AB, but the blood on the shroud presents yet another massive mystery. The color.
It's red.
It's a reddish carmine color. Now, think about dried blood in the real world. If you cut your finger and get a drop of blood on a white shirt, what color is it a week later?
It's brown. And eventually, it turns dark black.
Correct. Oxidized blood turns brown very quickly. The blood on the shroud is thousands of years old, or at least hundreds, yet it remains distinctly red. Skeptics pointed to this immediately and said, aha, it is paint. Real ancient blood would be pitch black.
So how did the chemists explain a red blood stain that never fades?
Dr. Alan Adler ran specific tests and found unusually high levels of bilirubin in the blood samples. Bilirubin is a yellowish-orange pigment that your liver produces.
That makes your skin turn yellow if you have jaundice, right?
Right, but your body also produces it in massive quantities in response to severe stress. If a person is violently tortured, beaten, scourged, deprived of water, the red blood cells break down rapidly, and the liver just dumps bilirubin into the bloodstream to compensate. Adler showed in the lab that if you mix high levels of bilirubin with oxidized hemoglobin, it creates a stable reddish color that essentially lasts forever.
So the fact that the blood is red isn't proof that it's a fake painting. It's actually biochemical proof that the person who bled on the cloth was severely tortured.
It is entirely consistent with a highly traumatic death, yes.
Now, I have to bring up a headline I saw a few years ago because it went viral. It said something like, "Nanoparticles prove Shroud victim was tortured." It sounded very sci-fi and definitive.
Ah, yes. The Carlinino study from 2017. They claimed to find creatinine and ferritin nanoparticles in the blood fibers that definitively proved extreme trauma. It was everywhere in the news cycle.
But we can't use it as evidence.
We absolutely cannot. And this is exactly why scientific literacy matters so much when researching this topic. That specific paper was officially retracted in 2018 by the journal PLOS One. The data just didn't hold up to peer scrutiny. The methodology they used was deeply flawed. So while the bilirubin theory from Adler is still scientifically sound, the nanoparticle proof is dead. We have to be honest about what is valid and what isn't.
Good. We stick to the valid data. Let's move to the anatomy of the image. Because medieval artists, they weren't exactly medical examiners.
No, they were not. If you look at any standard painting of the crucifixion from the year 1300, where are the nails placed?
Like in the palms.
No.
Always the center of the palms.
Right. It's iconic. It's how we picture it. But it is structurally, physically impossible.
Why? I mean, flesh is flesh.
If you take a heavy wrought iron nail and drive it through the soft tissue of a man's palm and then hang a 170-pound body from it, the nail will simply rip right through the flesh and fingers. The body falls to the ground. There is no bone structure in the palm to support that kind of downward weight.
Gravity wins.
Gravity always wins. To crucify someone effectively, and the Romans were brutal experts at this, you have to drive the nail through the wrist. Specifically through a gap called destot space, right between the carpal bones. The bones lock the iron nail in place. It bears the weight without tearing.
And on the shroud? Where are the wounds?
The blood flows clearly originate from the wrists, not the palms. This is a detail that directly contradicts 1,000 years of established artistic tradition. A forger in 1350 would have painted the palms because that is what everyone absolutely knew a crucifixion looked like. Painting the wrist would have looked wrong to a medieval audience. It would be bad marketing for a hoax.
There's also the thumb detail, right?
Yeah.
That always stuck with me.
The thumbs are missing.
Missing entirely.
They aren't visible on the hands in the image. They are folded inward. This is horrifyingly anatomically correct. If you drive a thick spike through Destot's space in the wrist, you severely damage the median nerve. The physical reaction to that nerve damage is immediate under. The thumb spasms and snaps violently inward, locking across the palm.
That is incredibly horrifyingly specific.
It is. It implies that whoever created this image had a working knowledge of forensic pathology and neurology that wasn't officially documented by science until the 20th century.
Or they weren't painting at all. They had a real traumatized body. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Section 7 in our outline, but realistically, number one in all of our minds, how? How did the image actually get onto the cloth? We know it's not a painting. We know it's not a heated statue scorch. We know it holds 3D topography.
This is the image formation enigma. And honestly, this is where normally calm scientists start whispering and looking uncomfortable. Because the only thing in all of our modern testing that has come close to replicating the specific visual effect is radiation.
Lasers.
Specifically, vacuum ultraviolet, or VUV, radiation. A team at EAA, which is the Italian National Agency for New Technologies, spent years blasting linen with different energy sources. They found that if you hit raw linen with a very short, unimaginably intense burst of VUV light, we are talking nanoseconds of exposure, you can perfectly color the very top layer of the surface without burning or destroying the deep threads.
You can recreate that exact 200 nanometer superficial depth.
Yes. They achieved a localized result that looks microscopically identical to the shroud image fibers.
But wait a minute. VUV lasers are massive, complex, modern machines requiring huge amounts of electricity.
Correct.
So if the shroud is real and it's from the 1st century, where did the VUV light come from inside a dark rock tomb?
That is the multi-million-dollar question. The miracle hypothesis, if you want to call it that, is that the body itself became a temporary source of intense light. For a fraction of a nanosecond, the physical matter of the body converted into energy. A flash of radiation that photochemically scorched the image onto the cloth.
That sounds like, that is the literal resurrection. That's a nuclear event.
It is an event horizon where our current understanding of physics simply breaks down. Science can tell you, hey, this looks exactly like radiation damage. But science absolutely cannot tell you, here is the biological mechanism for how a dead human body naturally emits VUV lasers. That is impossible biologically.
But surely the skeptics have a counter theory. They aren't just sitting there accepting that Jesus was a walking laser beam.
No, they are not. Science abhors a vacuum. The newest theory, published just recently in 2025 in the journal Archaeometry, is the bas-relief theory. It suggests that the 3D data might not come from a fully 3D human body, but from a shallow sculpture. A bas-relief.
Like the raised face on a coin.
Exactly like that, just life-sized. The idea is that a forger carves a shallow, flattened relief of a man, you heat it slightly, or maybe treat it with some kind of mild acid, and you press the wet linen cloth tightly over it. The cloth touches the high points, like the nose, very firmly, creating a dark mark, and it touches the low points, like the eyes, very lightly.
That would naturally create the distance map. That explains the VP8 results.
It would. It explains the 3D aspect beautifully, bringing it back into the realm of human art. But it completely fails the chemistry test. We still don't have the required scorch marks or the chemical acid residues that such a process would inevitably leave behind on the linen. And it absolutely doesn't explain the medical accuracy of the blood flows, which had to be applied separately.
So we basically trade one massive problem for another.
Always. That is the nature of Shroud research.
Before we wrap up the hard science portion, I have to ask you about the coins. I see this online all the time in forums. People claiming NASA proved there are coins on the man's eyes.
You need to be very, very careful with this one. Some researchers do claim they can see the faint imprint of Roman leptons. Those are specific small coins minted by Pontius Pilate, placed over the eyelids of the man in the image.
Which, if true, would be the ultimate historical timestamp.
It would be incredible, but most serious imaging experts call this pareidolia.
Pareidolia, that's the psychological phenomenon where I see a bunny shape in the clouds, right?
Or a human face on the surface of Mars. Our brains are hardwired to find familiar patterns. The shroud is a woven fabric. It has a complex, noisy herringbone weave. The image is faint and chaotic. If you stare at a chaotic, static pattern long enough and someone says, show me a coin with a staff on it, your brain will absolutely connect the random dots of the weave to make that coin appear.
So the coins are likely just our human brains playing tricks on us to find meaning in static.
I would firmly put the coins in the highly doubtful column. The data just isn't robust enough.
Okay, we are coming into the final stretch here. We need to address the history, the missing years. Because if this really is the burial cloth of Jesus, where on earth was it between 33 AD and 1350 AD? That is a 1,300-year historical black hole.
That is the dark tunnel. And the Mandelion theory is the best attempt to light it up. We know from historical texts that there was a very famous, highly venerated cloth called the image of Edessa, or the Mandelion. It was kept in what is now Turkey. It was famous across the Christian world for having the true face of Jesus on it, and it was famously described as being not made by human hands.
And the theory is that the Mandelion was actually the shroud the whole time.
But folded. If you take the long shroud and fold it 4 times, a method called tetradiplon, only the face shows in the center. It looks exactly like a portrait in a rectangular frame. The theory is that it was kept folded inside a reliquary for centuries, which protected it. Then, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade happens. The Crusaders sack the city of Constantinople in this massive, chaotic raid. They steal all the gold, all the relic.
And the Mandelion disappears from history.
Poof, gone. And then, conveniently, 150 years later, the shroud suddenly appears in a tiny church in France, owned by a knight who is a direct descendant of one of those crusaders. It fits together like a puzzle.
But there is a new piece of historical evidence that pushes hard the other way. We found a text from a guy named Nicole Oresme.
Nicole Oresme. He was essentially the Einstein of the 14th century, a brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and scientist. A newly analyzed text from 2025 shows him directly discussing a miraculous shroud in the Champagne region of France.
And he was not impressed by it.
Not at all. He bluntly calls it a clerical deception. He basically writes that the local church is faking miracles to drum up excitement and get money from traveling pilgrims.
So modern scientific skepticism isn't a modern invention at all.
No. The very moment the shroud appeared in France, the local bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote an angry letter to the Pope saying, "This is a fake. I know the artist who painted it."
But Stirp couldn't find the paint.
And that is the maddening, endless loop of this topic. We have a medieval bishop confessing in writing that it is a painting, and we have 20th century lasers and microscopes swearing on a stack of data that there is absolutely no paint. Who do you believe? The man who was standing right there in the 1300s, or the electron microscope in 1978?
This brings us to the end, the final synthesis. And honestly, my brain hurts from trying to hold all this conflicting data at once.
It should hurt. If your brain doesn't hurt after looking at this evidence, you aren't paying close enough attention.
We have a cloth that definitively dates to the Middle Ages via carbon-14, but dates to the Roman era via WXX crystal analysis and pollen types.
We have a perfectly proportional negative image that behaves identically to a photograph, yet it was documented at least 500 years before photography was even conceptualized.
We have blood that is chemically consistent with massive biological portraiture, but it stays bright red, like a painter's pigment.
We have an image that microscopically looks like a radiation scorch, but doesn't fluoresce under UV, and acts like a 3D distance map, but contains absolutely no physical pigment to create that map.
It really feels like science is acting like a flashlight in a huge, pitch-black warehouse.
That is a brilliant analogy. The flashlight beam hits a detail. Oh, look, Billy Rubin, and we think we understand the whole room. Then the beam swings and hits another detail. Oh, look, medieval carbon isotopes. And we are instantly confused again. We can clearly see the physical effects on the cloth, but we are completely blind to the cause.
The shroud is strictly an impossible object. It simply refuses to let the religious people have an easy win because of the medieval carbon dating. But it aggressively refuses to let the atheists and skeptics have an easy win because of the 3D physics in the anatomy.
It sits perfectly balanced right on the razor's edge of faith and science.
I have one final thought for you, the listener, to take away. Something that genuinely keeps me up at night regarding this object.
Hit me. Let's hear it.
Have you noticed that the shroud seems to perfectly evolve with our technology?
How do you mean?
Think about the timeline. In the 1800s, to the naked eye, it was just a faint, boring smudge. Then, as soon as we invented photography, it suddenly revealed a stunningly realistic face. In the 1970s, we invented the VP8 and spatial mapping, and suddenly revealed a perfect 3D body. In the 2000s, we invented DNA genomic sequencing and atomic WAXS dating, and it immediately revealed a global biological map and an internal crystal clock.
That is a really provocative thought.
It is like the object is sitting there waiting for us. It meets us at whatever exact level of technology we happen to have in that century.
Is it just a mirror reflecting our own desperate scientific capabilities back at us? Or is it an ancient time capsule perfectly encoded with data that we haven't even figured out how to read yet?
Maybe we just haven't invented the right machine yet to see the final piece of the puzzle.
Maybe the true answer isn't buried in the past at all. Maybe it is waiting for us in the future of physics.
Something for you to mull over tonight. That concludes our deep dive into the Shroud of Turin. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring the data.
It was an absolute pleasure.